Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. We're going to hang tight for just a few more minutes to allow other people to join. But thank you for coming today for today's webinar. We'll get started in just a few minutes. All right, as more people are joining us, I'm just going to start with my normal little housekeeping spiel, just in case there's anyone here who has not been to a webinar yet this semester. I do see a couple of new names in the participant list. So for those of you who do not know me, my name is Charla Rivera, and I'm the director of the Writing Lab. Every semester, we offer 10 to 12 weekly webinars like this one. We have 3 left this semester, including this one. But if there's any that you see on the list from earlier this semester that you wish you could have attended, a very similar schedule of webinars will be offered again in the spring. So if there's something earlier on that you wish you could have attended, you can attend it in probably February, March, depending on which one you're looking at. Today, we're going to be talking about in-text citations. So last week, we really dove into the what types of in-text citations you can use, when you should quote, when you should paraphrase, things like that. Today, we're really going to dive into paraphrasing. And for the first couple of slides, it will be a review of last week, since a couple of you weren't here last week. And even if you were here, it'll be good to review just kind of the difference between a quote and a paraphrase. And then I'll jump in and give you some tips on paraphrasing, and we'll even do some practice paraphrasing at the end, where everyone will do a little bit of practice. So I have my chat box open here, so if you have any questions while I'm going along, feel free to type them in the chat. And I think without further ado, we'll get started. Oh, I'll also say here that if you have any questions that you realize after this workshop that you wish you could have asked me, you can see the email here, scswritinglab@georgetown.edu. You can send an email to there and it will come straight to me and I'll be able to answer your question, okay? All right, so let's get started. So a little bit of a review from last week. What's the difference between a quote and a paraphrase? You can feel free to type something in the chat or unmute yourself if you'd like. I'll sit tight for maybe about 10 seconds to see if anybody wants to answer the question, and I'll move ahead. So what's the difference between a quote and a paraphrase? Great, thank you, Isaac. Yeah, a quote is verbatim. A quote is word for word from the original source. So a quote is using the exact words. It uses quotation marks, and in the case of APA, anybody who's in here who's using APA, which is going to be most of you, it's going to use page numbers in your in-text citation. That's different from a paraphrase, which uses the main idea of the original source, but uses different words. And so in this case, you don't need quotation marks, and nor do you need a page or paragraph number with APA. So we did this last week. I just wanted to review this with you. So when should you quote? Do you remember what I told you last week about how often you should quote versus how often you should paraphrase? So you may remember last week that I said, especially if you're in one of our graduate programs, and again, most of you probably are doing a graduate program, you want to quote as little as possible. Really only quote when it's a very powerful or distinctive quote, and you'll want to paraphrase most of the rest of the time. So you really want to quote almost never, okay? Use it sparingly, okay? You can use quotes, and this is review from last week. If somebody says something that just seems incredible that you're not sure someone else is going to believe you, that someone else had said this, you can quote them. If something is said in a very interesting or beautiful way, particularly if you're doing anything with philosophy or literature, you can use a quote. You can quote when you're doing a passage for analysis, or if you're providing a definition. There are a few times when you might use a quote, but really when in doubt, it's always better to paraphrase. The reason it's better to paraphrase is because then you're actually doing more of your own writing and more of your own thinking. Quotes just show that using a quote essentially just shows that under you understood what you read enough to know that it fits what you're trying to say, but not enough to actually apply it to your own thinking. So if you're actually able to paraphrase it, then it shows that you can not only understand the reading, but also apply it in your own thinking and apply it to other pieces of writing as well. So when should you paraphrase? Most of the time. Every other time, let's say 95% of the time, you should be paraphrasing. And you can use paraphrases to maintain the flow of the writing. You have your own voice, you have your own way of writing. So using too many quotes can make it feel really choppy to read, versus using paraphrases, which allows the reader to just flow along the thoughts with you. Okay. It also allows you to eliminate less irrelevant information. You can really just get down to brass tacks when you paraphrase. There's a lot you can leave out as long as it doesn't actually change the meaning. Okay. And then you can also use paraphrasing when you quote. You can also follow up that quote with a paraphrase to show that you understood it and you can explain it for your reader. Okay, so let's jump into what we're actually talking about today, which is how you paraphrase. It's actually a deceptively difficult skill. It does take some practice to do correctly or do successfully, I should say. So here's an example quote here that we're going to be working on today. The quote says, contrary to the common belief that spinning of cars mainly occurs on slippery roads at high speeds, the statistics show by far most severe accidents occur on dry roads and at speeds between 60 kilometers an hour and 100 kilometers an hour. So this is just a quote that I pulled out here that we're going to use to demonstrate the different steps we can take to paraphrase successfully. So this first step when we're paraphrasing is to determine the relevant points in the quote and the relationship between those points. Okay, so again, what's the key idea? What's the main idea? And if there's more than one idea, how are they related to one another? Okay, so looking back at our quote here about car accidents, we have this idea that there's a common belief of how accidents happen, which is contrary to the actual real life data. Okay, so that's essentially what we have here for our main ideas. And also the relationship is that the common belief and actual fact do not align. Okay, so we'll want to keep that in mind, not only that we have these two main points, but that the relationship between them is that they don't match up, they don't align. The next step is really thinking about the grammar. So our first step was thinking about the content. Do we understand the idea? What was the main idea? And if there's more than one idea, oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so it says spinning of cars. So Geraldine has a good question here. Technically, yes, it's saying spinning of cars versus an accident. So not every time a car spins, it may not mean that you actually crash. That's a good point. So maybe when we're paraphrasing, that's something we need to keep in mind, that spinning of cars may or may not actually equal an accident or a crash. Okay, that's a good reading. Okay, so we can consider the grammar here. So when you're thinking about grammar, when you're paraphrasing, you can consider quite a few things here. You can consider the tense that the original was written in. If the original was written in present tense, maybe you'll change it to past tense or something like that. You can also consider the parts of speech. So parts of speech are things like nouns, verbs, adjectives, that kind of thing. You can substitute keywords for a similar part of speech. So for example, if our original said the word environment, which is a noun, we could change it into environmental, which is an adjective, which would by its very nature force us to rewrite the sentence in some way, because we can't use the word environmental in the exact same place in a sentence where we would use the word environment. A similar example, the word severe, which is an adjective, changing it to severity, which is a noun. And you can also change the order of the sentence. So we could flip which idea is presented first, okay? So by changing the tense, which would be the verb tenses, past, present, or you know, we can get more involved with tense and go from perfect tense, but we won't get into all of that. You can think about your part of speech for the keywords and also changing the order of the sentence, okay? And you can also use different linking phrases or expressions to change the order of the sentence, but still show the relationship between the ideas, okay? So here's some example linking phrases or expressions. Here we're talking about, you know, I like to call these connectors. So you can, these all obvious, if you're a native speaker, then this kind of seems second nature to you that this list is here. If you're a non-native speaker, it can take a little bit extra practice to be thinking about how, which linking phrases or connectors to use in different situations, okay? So going back to our original quote here, remembering that the relationship was that the common belief and actual fact do not align, okay? That means that we're probably going to use a linking phrase that's going to show some sort of level of disagreement or surprise, or that there's basically a mismatch between the ideas. So linking phrases or expressions that we could use in this particular case are however, although, or while. This is not an exhaustive list. There are many more connectors and linking phrases out there, but these are just the ones I pulled out for this presentation. So you can think about, okay, I want to use however, or I want to use while, or anything like that once you know the relationship. Step 3 is to consider synonyms, okay? So thinking about synonyms, I want to give you a word of caution here on synonyms, because of course not all synonyms work equally well in all contexts. So when you're reading through and you're deciding on synonyms, you want to be really careful to not just go into, you know, thesaurus.com and type in the word and then put in whatever the first or second entry is that pops up, because it may or may not actually work well in the meaning, in the intended meaning of the original sentence. So for example, here's a quote: "The public perception of vehicle systems and the benefits they offer are vital." Okay, now compare that with one where I have a couple of synonyms here. It is very important to consider the municipal views regarding vehicle systems and the advantages they give. Now, technically, public and municipal are synonyms, but they're not synonyms in every case. And so to use the word municipal in this example actually changes the meaning of the word, because or the sentence rather, because the original sentence using the word public does not seem to have anything to do with government, where the word municipal does seem to have a feeling of a local government. So while they could be interchangeable in some situations, they're not interchangeable in this situation. So when you are choosing a synonym, you'll want to be careful that you're choosing a synonym that actually works. So we can compare that. For example, we can change public to consumer, which again, public and consumer can sometimes be interchanged. And in this case, they do work. They do have a similar meaning to what the original intended meaning of the sentence was. Also, I just want to note that you don't have to change every single word, especially if it's going to sound a little bit silly. So for example, you'll notice that in the original one, we have the term vehicle systems. Maybe there's some different way to say that, but if it feels like you'd be bending over backwards to try to say something else using different words, there are key words that you can keep without changing. So it does take a little bit of practice to consider which words are okay to keep and which ones you can swap out. But if you are, you know, bending over backwards and it sounds like you're an alien from outer space when you try to think of new synonyms or a new way to say something, you can keep it with the original. And if you're ever in doubt, just add a quotation mark. Okay, I know I said not to quote very often, but yes, thank you. You were probably typing that just as I was about to say it. Yes, unless it's something that's really common, like in a past iteration of this, same workshop, I used to have an example quote that used the term human body heat or something like that. You can think of a way to say that does not use the words human body heat, but you're going to sound like an alien. So in that case, you don't really need to use the quote because there's not a supernatural way to say it. However, if there's ever a question, just use a quote. I will, even if you come to tutoring, I'll say that to you, you know. If there's ever a question mark, put a quote, you're going to be the safest. Yes, anytime there's a quotation mark, you do need to put the page or paragraph number. Okay, so let's go back to our original quote here and think about some synonyms. Now, I'm a little self-conscious because I think I might have spinning of cars coming up as a crash, so I might actually have to revise this workshop based on what Geraldine has pointed out earlier. But so we have some key words here that I've pulled out: spinning of cars, slippery, most, occur, dry roads. So you can see here, yep, here I have spinning of cars becomes crashes. Slippery could become wet or slick. Most can become the majority of. Occur can become happen. And then good conditions can be dry roads. Now, this wouldn't be enough. It's never enough to just substitute keywords and then call it a day. You really do need to use some mixing of some of the other tips that I was giving you, whether it's changing a verb around or changing the order of the sentence or things like that. So it's not enough to simply think of synonyms. You also have to change around the grammar and the rest of that too. So putting it all together, here we have my original quote here, and here's a paraphrase for it. Although it is widely believed that most car accidents can be attributed to high speeds and poor road conditions, in fact, according to Van Zanten, the majority of serious accidents happen when roads are dry and the vehicle is traveling between 60 and 100 kilometers per hour. So you notice here with the 60 and 100 kilometers per hour, that's a case when we're talking about numbers, unless I'm going to convert it to miles per hour or some other thing, it doesn't really make sense to try to paraphrase that actual specific number. So it actually is okay in this particular case to just keep the 60 km and 100 km, and that's fine. But again, if there's ever a question, if you're ever not sure, just quote it. Your professor is not going to complain that you put quotations around something, but your professor might complain if you accidentally plagiarize. So it's always safer to put that quote there if you're not sure. So some other final tips for paraphrasing, and then we'll get into some practice. So even though everything I just did with our example quote, we were reading that quote pretty closely, I actually recommend when you're paraphrasing to not look at the original. I recommend just setting it aside, closing your book, closing the web tab or whatever, and just writing what you remember it saying without looking at it closely. And then once you've written your paraphrase, you can go back and check and make sure that it's not too similar. Okay, so you can be thinking about grammar, you can be thinking about vocabulary and all of that, but it can be even better to just set the original aside and write it from memory as if you were explaining it to a friend, and then double check it and make sure it's not too similar. If you're writing a longer research paper, it can be even better to take your notes by paraphrasing rather than copying and pasting while you research or writing things word for word, because then you're so far removed from the actual original reading. You know, maybe you did your research a month ago and now you're actually sitting down to write. There's no way you remember the exact word for word. And so you can, you should double check your original source to make sure you're not changing the meaning. But if you just jotted down your notes in point form and paraphrased those, then that keeps you even safer from accidentally plagiarizing by using something that's too similar. Just because the way your brain's going to work, unless you have some amazing photographic memory, which maybe you do, but chances are you don't remember the exact word for word a month later. Okay, so if you are writing your notes as paraphrases, that does you a lot of good. It also, one other thing about writing your notes as paraphrases rather than, especially if you're taking your notes electronically, to write your notes as paraphrases rather than copying and pasting actually helps you learn the content better. If you're copying and pasting, your brain is kind of like, okay, I have that in my notes, I don't need to remember it now. But the act of actually paraphrasing it and adding it to your notes yourself is going to help you remember it and also help you make connections between other ideas later because you're going to have a deeper understanding. Okay, so definitely try to paraphrase while you're taking notes, especially for a larger research project. It's going to be helpful, more helpful for you all around, not just for the paraphrasing itself, but also just the connecting of ideas. Remember the general steps that I gave you. So thinking about the grammar, thinking about synonyms, thinking about, really importantly, thinking about the ideas and the relationship between the ideas can be really helpful as well. So it's really important. I think I just summarized all of this. Yep. So understand the main idea and the connections, the relationship between those ideas, considering the grammar, and also using synonyms very carefully, making sure that we understand what the synonyms actually mean. So I actually have a shared Google Doc that we can all move to. I'm putting the link in the chat. In this shared Google Doc, let me bring up the doc itself. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes. I have an example quote here. Actually, I'm not going to share my screen. I'm just going to allow you to come to the Google Doc. If you just click the link or type, or you should see it in the chat. We have here the quote, "Ever increasing traffic forces the driver to process a growing amount of information and at the same time to make more and quicker decisions. Thus, in critical situations, the amount of information may exceed the driver's effective processing capability." So what I want you to do, I'm going to give you maybe 5 minutes. I want you to read this quote and I want you to attempt to paraphrase it. And you can put your attempted paraphrase right in this Google Doc. And after about 5 minutes, we'll go over them together. If you don't want your fellow students to know which paraphrase you wrote, you can copy and paste, put it into a different document and work on it there, and then bring it back to this document and then copy and paste and click away. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys about 5 minutes to work on this paraphrase, thinking about the steps that I gave you. And after about 5 minutes, I'll see what paraphrases are there, and we'll go over and see, we'll go over each one and give a little bit of feedback. So about 5 minutes to work on that. So I'm going to share my screen now, but you don't need to click on your Zoom screen. You can also just follow along on the Google Doc. But let's look at these together. Thank you, everybody, for being a good sport and writing your example paraphrase. So let's look again at our original one. So ever-increasing traffic forces the driver to process a growing amount of information and at the same time to make more and quicker decisions. Thus, in critical situations, the amount of information may exceed the driver's effective processing ability. So let's think about the main ideas that are in here, and then we'll look at what everybody has written. I see here that there are essentially 2 main ideas, maybe we could say it 2.5. So we have the idea that traffic is increasing and that the driver needs to make decisions, make a higher number of decisions and do it more quickly. So we kind of have the factual, there's just more traffic, drivers needing to make more, quicker decisions, okay? Then we have kind of this second idea. So that's where I would call it maybe 1.5 ideas. Okay, then we have the second idea that not only is the driver needing to make more and quicker decisions, but the driver may not actually have the ability to make the decisions as a situation may necessitate. Okay, so we're going to read over these paraphrases and just kind of see if we have all of the ideas there, and if so, are they presented, you know, that kind of thing, and whether or not all of the ideas, whether the words are too similar or anything like that. So let's start with number 1. By the way, if you want to remain anonymous, you can just click somewhere else, click your cursor somewhere else, and then your name will not appear if I accidentally mouse over. If you see, if when I mouse over, I can see anonymous camel over here. So you can click away if you don't want anyone to know which one is yours. So the first one, a driver's ability to experience, process, and respond to road conditions, particularly dangerous ones, is made even more difficult by the increasing volume of cars on streets and highways. I think that sounds pretty good. I think that is good for our first 1.5 ideas, but we are kind of missing that second idea that the amount of information may exceed the driver's effective processing capability. So I think this first one is a pretty good paraphrase for our first idea, but we are actually missing that pretty key part that the driver may not actually be able to successfully make good decisions. Okay, let's check the next one. An ever-growing traffic volume produces more information for a driver to process and a shorter time to make decisions. The result is, oh, we don't need a comma there. The result is that in moments of crisis, the volume of information may be more than the driver can process effectively. This is great. I think this includes our ideas there. And I also like the use of using different parts of speech. The original one says the driver's effective processing capability, where this one says more than the driver can process effectively. So we have some use of synonyms there. I also noticed the ever growing versus ever increasing. Okay. Let's check. Ooh, somebody's added a new one since I last checked. Okay. The ability of a driver to take safe and accurate actions when driving in heavy traffic can be impeded by the sheer amount of information that is available. I don't know if I would use the word available because it seems like they can kind of choose whether to take the information or not, where it seems to me if you're driving on a very congested road, you shouldn't be picking and choosing your information. Otherwise, I think this is fine, but I'm just not sure I would use the word available. As a result, driving has become increasingly dangerous. This is almost there. Again, we don't really have the reason why it's dangerous, because again, the reason it's dangerous is because literally the driver's brain may not be able to actually process the information, okay? So we're almost there with that one. When drivers encounter more traffic, they must process more information at a faster rate about the environment around them. Ooh, thank you for using Intext citations. I didn't even ask you to do that. Good work. As a result, Swales and Feek note, drivers can become overwhelmed by the rapid changes in their environment. Okay. I think that sounds good. I think I might just add extra information about a critical situation, since this has the sense of like maybe a crash would occur, where this one just means that they're overwhelmed. So it doesn't necessarily sound like we're having an accident in the situation, but it could be. And lastly, the amount of traffic on the road is directly correlated to the danger presented to drivers. This is because drivers are asked to make several decisions in a short amount of time. The amount of traffic on the road is directly correlated to the danger presented to drivers. I'm not sure what the danger presented to drivers means. I think this one's almost there. I think we could say something about, again, I think we need to say that there's a lot going on in the road. So rather than saying the danger presented, you could say, you know, the amount of information presented to drivers, or how, I mean, I wouldn't use the word chaotic, but you could use something that would say something about the chaos that's on the road, that there's just so much information to process. But this one's almost there. Okay. Oh, we have another one. You guys are adding some extra surprises in here. Thank you. So constant traffic has a negative impact on drivers' ability to quickly process information. Traffic inundates drivers with information that slows down their ability to process information in critical situations. This is really, really close. I'm not sure the information slows down their ability to process. I think their ability to process happens at the same speed, but then there's just too much information that they can't follow. But overall, I know it seems like I'm being very critical and harsh with these, and that's because, you know, this is the point of today's workshop. Overall, these are mostly very successful paraphrases, and if these were to appear in some of your work with your professors, I don't think your professors would complain too much about it. So overall, you guys really did a great job. Okay. So that's actually it for today's presentation. I have one more slide, and it literally just says questions. So if you guys do have any questions, I will hang out for a few minutes to answer any of them. If you have any questions later on, as always, you can send me an email, scswritinglab@georgetown.edu. Okay, so thank you for making time with us today. If you need to head out and make a sandwich, go for it. Otherwise, I'll hang out for a few minutes. Okay. I have a question about grammar/syntax. about how far the paraphrase should be from the syntax of the original. I mean, that's not really something that is easy to measure, but you really want to make it as different as you can while keeping the meaning. So that's kind of why I'm saying, you know, just substituting synonyms is not quite enough. Even just substituting a different linking or connecting word wouldn't be quite enough. It is better to really move around the syntax as much as we can. Although, of course, what syntax is a pretty complicated concept, whether it is a combination of things like tense and word order and idea order and things like that. So there's not really a quick and easy way to measure it, but you do want to change as much as you can from the original. Any other questions? All right, if you are typing a question, go ahead and copy and paste it into an email to me. I am happy to respond to any emails. Um, I'm going to hop off for today, but again, if you have any questions, you can follow up with an email or you can come to one of the following workshops and I'll be happy to talk to you then. So thank you again for coming and joining with us today. I hope to see you at a future workshop. I think my next one is in 2 weeks. We'll be talking about abstracts. So, all right, have a good afternoon, everyone.